Hi, and welcome to this section on configuration and coordination. So this video is about multi-source configuration with microprofile config. Okay then, let's switch to our IDE straight away. Now, as you know, I've always prepared a small README file with all the instructions, and I've also prepared a Git branch for you to start. So make sure you check out the Git branch video 3.1. So what is this all about with the enabling multi-environment configuration? As you know from the 12-factor principles, you should have one image for all the environments your microservice will run in. And for sure, there are some configuration values that are highly environment specific. So maybe you have an integration environment and a QA environment, a pre-prod and a prod environment. So you may have 4 environments with different configuration values. And microprofile config can help you with that. It enables you to store your configuration values in property files, for example, or environment variables and system properties. So let's see what you have to do this. Well, first up, we need to add the microprofile config API dependency to our build. So here we have that. Again, we already had that in here. So provided compile microprofile config API currently in version 1.3. So that's that. Now, the next thing is what you can do is, well, you can have dedicated configuration beans, for example, where you can inject the configuration properties. So let's create a class, call it config bean, and the config bean will be a normal manage bean, like usual, so it's an application scope bean. So what if you wanted to obtain the hostname, for example? As you know, the hostname is usually supplied as an environment variable automatically. So what you have here is you say add inject, add config property, and you give it a name, hostname. And microprofile config will make sure that it first looks up a system property called hostname. If that's not available, it will use an environment variable, so it will uppercase everything, so it's uppercase hostname, and last but not least, it will look in property files, for example. So that's simple, right? Now there are other ways of injecting config properties. Maybe you have some optional config properties. What you can now do is, well, you can specify optional or string. And the third part which you can do is you can specify so-called dynamic and reloadable config properties. So using the provider interface here, we can look up this dynamic string configuration value every time we invoke the get on this provider. What you will want to do here is we will insert a few getters, right? So what we can do is a few getters here. And here, instead of using the provider, what we can say, well, we can say get here. So every time you invoke this method, we will dynamically look up this value here. So this makes a lot of sense if you have externable reloadable property files, for example. Now, you can pretty much inject any basic type. So what you see here, for example, we inject a long value, for example. In here, we also specify a default value. And you can also specify string arrays or list of strings or sets of strings, for example. So what this does is basically look up a configuration value, which is called a.string.array. And the value is a comma-separated list. And microprofile config will take care of parsing and delimiting the value. So you get back a string array in this case. Now, I said before, there are certain sources where the system looks up those configuration values. So this is either system properties, environment variables, or the special file called microprofile config properties. So you see that here. There's, for example, the string array, comma-separated list. And what you can also do is you can specify, for example, environment variables when you run your container. So this case here, I have the Docker Compose file. And I say the optional string is this value, and I specify a long. Right. Now, what if you want to inject configuration values that are not primitive or not inbuilt? Well, what you can do is you can implement custom converters. So let's say I wanted to implement a converter for JSON objects. So I have complex configuration objects. So I've implemented this class here. It's called JSON object converter. It needs to implement the converter interface from Profile Config SPI. And in here, I'm going to pass the string value of the property. And all I do is I use JSONP, for example, well, to read the JSON object of the string value. So using this approach here, you can, for example, specify your configuration value like this here. And in your configuration bean, what you can now do is do the following. So you can now inject a config property of type JSON object. So that's pretty neat. All you have to do is, well, there is this meta-inf services service loader file. So in here, what you have to do is you have to specify the JSON object converter in here. Right. So what else is there? Well, you also have the possibility to have programmatic configuration. So let's create a new file. Let's call it config resource. And using this approach here, instead of injecting the configuration values, you can programmatically query the configuration values from Profile Config, right? So this is here, Profile Config, that's the interface. You can inject this config interface directly, and then using this interface, you can, for example, get the list of different config sources. So for system properties, config files, etc., etc. And you can also use the config interface to obtain the value programmatically like this. So if you deploy everything, so let's make sure you build the WAR file and you deploy it using Docker Compose. If you open your REST editor, and let's query the configuration endpoint. So what you see now here is the different configuration sources. So here you get all the property names which are specific to Payara. Here you get different system properties, for example. Next up will be the environment variables. So here's the A-long, cluster, module, and so on and so forth. Right? So if you want to query the host name, for example, we can issue this command here. And this is the host name of our Docker container at the moment. Or we have the string array. So let's query this one programmatically. And here you get back those values. Or the optional string which we specified is environment variable. So let's get this one. So also here, that's the value from the Docker Compose environment variable.